I don't know, I wouldn't say invited necessarily, but I just saw like, oh, all I need to do comics is some paper and pen and I can start drawing.
Hey, this is The Big Story. I'm Alex Morrissey. Thanks for joining me. I'm at the point in my book, or the rewriting of my book for the however many times, I'm at a point where I can glimpse a structural breakthrough and an improved clarity of voice, but it's not so much in the actual writing of the book at the moment. It's more about doing the writing about the writing of the book. So I had some insights that have me focusing on a lot of the character promises and plot promises and things that I knew, but I had not put down on the page in a way that made the reader go, ooh, I get this. And not spelling it out, but really breadcrumbing with a bigger crumb. I don't know how else to put it, but it's been actually pretty exciting. And it is great to sit down and feel purposeful at the keyboard. So I'm pretty excited about that. I'm also doing a lot of preliminary work on the comic series that I've taken the reins over on, which is pretty exciting to think about where I can take this series and bring this arc to a conclusion. Looking forward to sharing more of that. Today's guest is Matt Madden. Of course, you know that because you clicked on this. Matt reached out to me months ago after we had this kind of supportive exchange about his book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story. And it was a phenomenal talk. He is this rare split between an artist and an academic, not something very common in the comic book business. So it was really an insightful conversation full of some interesting turns, and I hope you enjoyed them too. So this is me with Matt Madden. There's a term which I never even knew existed, which is what TBR, which is to be read.
Right.
Which is, I've just always called it my, my reading list or my book, my stack of books. But,
yeah.
And, but there's that. And then there's like all the things you need to watch, all the things you need to listen to. Like the list is just so endless.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's overwhelming.
I look for excuses to, if there's some reason to catch one thing or another. And like, so Moon Age Daydream was actually playing in a movie theater in town. So I was like, I'll watch it eventually on video, but to get to see it with a good sound system and on a big screen is probably, it sounds like it's a very, it's more of an immersive experience of Bowie's in his totality than a straightforward documentary or interview kind of movie. So it was worth seeing it in that context for sure.
We live in Asheville, which is very small. So we have two arts theaters, but speaking of, this is the weirdest totem. This came from David Bowie's apartment.
Really? What is it?
It is a metal chrome backsplash tile for the kitchen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And how'd you come into the possession of that, or is that not public information?
No, it's okay. The family sold the apartment in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So in the fall of 2020, they sold the apartment, and the new owners were doing some renovations. And I was visiting my friend, and his phone rang, and he hung up the phone, and he goes, "Hey, do you want to go to David Bowie's apartment on Wednesday?"
Wow.
I was like, yeah. So we went over there. They were looking to see if his company could remove things from the apartment. So I went over there with tape measure in hand and camera ready to go. And we spent about an hour to an hour and a half there just being in the space, which was just phenomenal. And they were clearly redoing the kitchen.
Yeah.
And the stack of these untouched tiles. And I'm like, well, I'm taking a tile.
Nice.
Yeah. My thievery is just there. I'm okay with it.
That's a worthwhile one that I would say for sure.
Yeah. Matt, where Where do you live?
I'm in Philadelphia.
Oh, wow. Beautiful.
Yeah, I've been here since 2016.
Okay.
So my wife, Jessica Abel, is also a cartoonist. We've been together since, we've been married since 2000, together since 1997. And in that time, we've lived together in Chicago, Mexico City, New York, and a couple different places in Brooklyn, and had kids there. And then when our kids were 2 and 4 years old in 2012, we picked up and moved to Angoulême, France, where I ended up living for 4 years, on the pretext of a residency at a thing called La Maison des Auteurs, which is one of the few residencies specifically for cartoonists in the world, really. So lived there from 2012 to 2016. And then Jessica got a job at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts as the chair of their relatively new illustration program. So we found ourselves in Philadelphia. And it's been great. I mean, it was on our radar. We visited over the years and always liked it. And we decided we weren't going to move back to New York just because it was just going to be too much of a slog with 2 children. And, the fact of never having to deal with like the New York City school system because our kids were too young to have to deal with that whole thing was like such a relief that, Philadelphia is relatively straightforward in that sense. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. So first off, great appreciation for France and their love for cartooning.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm actually going back on Sunday, flying back to Angoulême. The French edition of Ex Libris is being published by L'Association, who's my main French publisher. It's actually coming out in February, but we're doing a pre-release event at the Angoulême Comics Festival, which starts a week from tonight, actually.
Nice.
It's the opening of the festival. And then I'm actually going to go to Spain for a few days. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, but the Spanish edition of Ex Libris came out last spring, and they weren't able to bring me over at the time. So they're going to piggyback a little mini book tour in Barcelona and Madrid right after the festival. Then I'll be back. But yeah, France, Americans have a bit of a blinkered notion of just what a paradise of comics France is. It's not like comics are really considered on the same level of literature and cinema and classical music, the way the impression you get sometimes when people talk about France. But it is much more of a prevalent part of the culture. And it's not as purely associated with superhero comics and newspaper strips as it was in the US, at least until 10, 15 years ago. And my experience, living in Angoulême was interesting because it's not really, it's sort of the comics capital of France, but only by default because they established a festival there in the 70s, and eventually that led to them opening a museum. And now there's this big complex called La Cité Internationale de la Bande Dessinée et de l'Image. It's like this complex of the museum, a library, the residency program, a really nice bookstore, a restaurant, a repertory theater, like film theater, a restaurant that goes in and out of business, and so the city has in various administrations gotten into embraced the aspect of comics. So like in Angoulême, all of the street signs. There's that classic French street sign, I'm sure you've seen in movies and stuff. There's sort of a blue rectangle with a white, little white line frame around it, and then the street name in white in a sort of, chunky serif font. In Angoulême, they have those blue signs, but instead of that white rectangle, it's actually a word balloon that has the street names in them.
Oh, very cool.
And I found living there and knowing, and my kids going to the local public school and just like hanging out with shopkeepers and the local doctor and dentist and whatever, there was definitely like a kind of mixed reaction, a mixture of like admiration and resentment of, all this comic stuff going on around you. A lot of people there's still an attitude similar to America where like comics are sort of kid stuff, even if there's clearly like great stuff. And I find when you press any one person, often turns out they don't just read, everyone's like, oh, I read, Tintin and whatever when I was a kid. But if you go to people's houses, actually, you're much more likely to have contemporary, art comics, or even like, current fantasy and whatever's, and increasingly manga on their bookshelves. So, I would say it's a few steps along in the general cultural reception of comics, while still not being the utopia that sometimes we Americans imagine it to be.
Well, we want it to be out there, Matt. We want to have that utopian society that
you got to have that to strive for. Yeah.
Sure. How did comics come into your radar? Like, were you young? Were you a fully formed human? Like, when did they show up in there?
I didn't really get into them until I was much older. I've read them off and on throughout my life, among other things that I was into. So the other thing about me is that I lived in Paris for 5 years when I was a kid. My dad is retired. He was a lawyer and for a firm that had an office in Paris. And I think my mom basically noodled him into begging for a post over there.
Sure.
So I lived there from the age of 3 to 8 years old. And ironically, that's the one time in my life when I was really into Marvel comics. I used to read Marvel comics in translation. There were these collections called Strange, which is strange in French. And each one would be kind of 3 or 4 Marvel comics. It would be like Daredevil and various stuff that was coming out in the early 70s, late 60s. And, I would buy those on the newsstand and along with some of the French comics. And then for whatever reason, as soon as I moved back to the States in 1976, I totally dropped my interest in superhero comics. I never really read them again. But years later, when I was a teenager, it was like a cascade effect of a bunch of stuff in a very short period of time. Between the age of 16 and 18, I discovered the old heavy metal, the sort of first run of heavy metal from the 70s when they were printing Mobius and Enki Bilal and stuff like that, and weird strips like The Bus. And somehow I got hip to Crazy Cat early on. And then there was that first reprint of, Crazy Cat, The Art of George Harriman, that Patrick McDonnell and some other people, it's like 3 authors put together. And that totally blew my mind. And that also somehow led me to Little Nemo and the work of Winsor McCay. I found just totally at random, found a collection of early Robert Crumb comics, a book called Head Comics. I think there was actually, it's one of those things where like how times have changed. Like this is published by like Simon & Schuster or something. And it was just like super, hardcore, excerpts from the early Zap magazines. And what else? So and then, as I started to read up on this kind of stuff and talk to people about it, and I didn't really have other friends who were into this stuff. It was really sort of a solitary investigation. At some point, I guess I discovered Mouse, and that led me to Raw Magazine, and that led into, and this is like the late 80s.
Sure.
And meanwhile, that's when like Love and Rockets was really hitting its stride. Dan Clowes, like the Fantagraphics was having its sort of first wave of successes with Dan Clowes when he was still doing Lloyd Llewellyn, the detective comic, and Pete Bag's Hate. And I was in Ann Arbor at the time, was where I got my undergrad degree in comp lit, and I was a college radio DJ, and that led me to we were doing a fundraiser, and I've told this story a bunch of times, but there was a cartoonist named Terry Laban who's still out there. He actually lives in Philadelphia now, coincidentally, and he was doing like political comics, political cartoons in the local paper. And I also had seen in some bookstores around town, he had a mini comic called Unsupervised Existence. And I didn't even really know what a mini comic was. I'd just seen this little comic book with a sort of underground style to it. And so I called him up and asked if he would design a button as a premium for our, college radio fundraiser. And he invited me over to his studio and we hung out, and he told me all about mini comics, and he gave me a bunch of random mini comics he had lying around, including something called The Amazing Cynical Man by a cartoonist named Matt Feazell, who kind of invented, or at least sort of formalized, the mini comics format that we know today. And it turned out he lived in the area as well. So they said they got together every week and had coffee and, doodled in their sketchbooks and talked about comics. And they invited me to come along with them. And Terry gave me a few copies of an old magazine called Fact Sheet 5, which was kind of like a printed internet of comics and zines, where it would just come out once a month or bi-monthly, full of listings. And it was just a very brief capsule review, the address, and whether they take trades, or if not, how many stamps or dollars you would need to send to get this thing through the mail. And that really gave me the motivation and the realization that was this easy point of entry to just do my own thing. I didn't really have a scene that I was part of, so just finding this mail art world out there that I could just send stuff out to was a real revelation. And so what started as kind of as a hobby I was doing on the side, became more and more of an obsession. And here I am today. Really,
right.
Really look back.
It's so. It is fascinating how the underground network of whatever the thing is, whether it's the hardcore punk scene from the early to mid 80s, getting cassettes around from one another. I mean, there was this whole sort of network, and the same thing is applied for this underground comic scene. Yeah, to me, there's a story, there's a documentary, there's something that needs to be told to express this.
Yeah, well, it's the larger DIY ethic, which does go back largely to the punk scene and to people, independent labels putting stuff out, and the Buzzcocks putting out their first EP on their own in the UK in 1977 or whatever. That's a big part of it. And it goes back further, I think, to some of the early sci-fi fanzines. I think some of the earliest go back to even the 30s. These self-published, fan publications devoted to science fiction. Mm-hmm. There was a cool exhibit when I was visiting New York one time when I was in college. It must have been the late 80s, called Samizdat, which was a comics and zine show, but they were drawing connection to the Soviet era, Samizdat, which is self-publishing in the former Soviet Union. That was this very underground active resistance of having this, underground publishing world. So, all of these threads come together, and they very much are a part and parcel of, I think, the socio-political times that we grew up in, and the technology, because this is all, of course, pre-internet. And if you wanted to share stuff with people and get it out in the world, you could find people in person, or you could trade stuff through the mail.
Right. I would go to comic conventions in the 80s, and they were very different collection of people than it is today, or at least that same group of people are in there, but they're filtered through a much, wider cultural sampling. And the people I would meet, everybody was insanely passionate about either a specific thing or the entire thing. There was this real interesting, there are people who were 1984, 85, obsessed with Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that show that's on PBS, how do you know about this? It was so random.
Sure.
But I think there's this,
I think at that time, if you were going to go to any kind of comics or sci-fi convention, it's because you were already pretty much had drunk the Kool-Aid and were super into it. Yeah. I don't think you found a lot of casual visitors at a Comic-Con in those days.
No, because like you were saying earlier about it being kid stuff, that was the predominant understanding tenfold. in 1983, 84, people were thinking, oh, well, there is some interesting stuff being done. No one said that. It was just funny books.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where was that show? The Russian lensed.
It was like in what we would now call a pop-up space, I think. It was like early on Williamsburg. I feel like it was one of the first times I went to Williamsburg, kind of in the, I said the 80s, but it might have been, late 80s, early 90s, I think. Yeah.
All right. I was in art school in New York City studying comic books. Mm-hmm. You would think they would have mentioned that to us.
It was one, I can't remember. There were two guys that were some of the main curators. There was a guy named Steven Serio, who I think is Cerio, who he's still out there. I think I occasionally see work from him. And another guy who had a pen name that is escaping me right now. It was an unusual exhibit. I remember it was like a sort of warehouse space or an old storefront. And it had, part of the exhibit was like all these zines hanging from strings on the ceiling, and you could just sort of like pick something up and flip through it and keep on moving around.
That's cool.
And I remember I wrote to one of the guys afterwards saying, "Oh, that was cool. I kind of wanted to just grab one." And he's like, well, and he chided me for not stealing it. He's like, "That's what it was there for. You should have stolen it."
Which is so of the ethic at the time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's so cool. So what was the feeling for you like when you first, because I'm sure you had this sense of, I don't know, like, did you feel like you were given permission, in Ann Arbor, like to like, hey, you two can do this by like meeting with that cartoonist? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even without meeting Terry Laban and Matt Vazal was crucial for me because it made me part of a community that I wasn't directly part of. But even before that, I had just through my own passion for comics and my sense of their potential had started to do stuff on my own and just in sketchbooks. And right now I'm like going through, we moved back in the spring to a new house here in Philadelphia. So I've been going through a lot of our old boxes, trying to like put stuff in order. And we're going to give some stuff to the Billy Ireland Library in Columbus, some of our old mini comics archives and correspondence from that time. Because at this point, it really is kind of a time capsule of an era that is, bygone in a lot of ways, of the mail correspondence and some of the early, conventions that we used to have. But yeah, I always felt like, I don't know, I wouldn't say invited necessarily, but I just saw like, oh, all I need to do comics is some paper and pen and I can start drawing. I didn't have and also because I was discovering stuff that was more offbeat, underground comics and, even before mini comics, I didn't have, I think if you grew up reading superhero comics, you're more likely to have a sense of like, oh, it's a very rigid, professional, hierarchical world. And you have to start in the mailroom and, almost like a corporation, work your way up to the top, or go to art school to get the drawing skills, go to the Kubert school to have the anatomy chops to be able to draw. I never had that sense that like there were particular skills I needed to know. And, I was already really into punk rock and post-punk and new wave and that aspect of DIY was already instilled in me, I think. So that might have played into it as well. But yeah, once I met Matt and Terry and we started hanging out and meeting other cartoonists, and there weren't a lot of us, but there were a few I was in Ann Arbor and Matt eventually moved to Hamtramck, which is a Polish kind of it's actually a municipality within Greater Detroit. Where his wife has actually been the mayor for a very long time. But we would go hang out at a cafe there sometimes, or we'd hang out in Ann Arbor or in Ypsilanti where he was living, which is where Iggy Pop grew up. And they took me to my first comics convention. I went to the Chicago Comic Con in probably 1989 or 1990 or so. Going there with some people who are, had been doing it for a while was great because they introduced me to people and kind of showed me the artist alley and like showed me what people did there. I don't think we tabled or anything. We just went to go check it out, and so it was great. I do think an advantage of today's cultural world is it's definitely much more invitational. Like, if I'd been, a person of color, if I'd been, there were a lot less women involved in that. Although, there were definitely women doing, underground comics and mini comics at the time, as much or more than you'd find like in the music scene, say. But I didn't see a lot of different skin colors, anyone queer, only if they were like outrageously out in a sort of divine sort of way, then they make themselves known. But I think they're, if you were gay, you're not necessarily going to be out there doing proudly open comics. So just qualifying the access is like, I was also a young college educated white guy who, didn't particularly feel there's a certain entitlement there to feel like I can just show up in any scene and make myself at home, which I don't think everyone else had that at the time. But no,
that's well. So because I mean, looking at it from a my shifted perspective over, because my attention was very much on working for Marvel or DC, but our makeup of our classmates, studying comics.
I'm sorry, where did you study?
Oh, at the School of Visual Arts.
Okay, so because I taught there later on, but we would have been still undergrads at that time, I suppose. What year did you graduate?
91.
Okay. Oh yeah, I finished college in 1990, so we're the same generation. So yeah. So did you go to art school thinking like, this is what I need to do if I want to be a superhero cartoonist? I need to like go to art school, go to SVA and study with Harvey Kurtzman and who's there at the time? Carmine Infantino or
Carmine. Carmine took over. Yeah, I had Sal. I love Sal. Sure. Yeah. It was great. I'm glad I went there versus the Kubert School, just because it being in New York City really offered me a lot more access to so many more things than just comic books.
Absolutely. SVA has that huge advantage that I saw it all the time. I mean, I taught there for 11 years and in teaching, like from the second year, my wife and I taught a storytelling class together, and I taught an ink drawing class. And later I also did some senior classes and stuff like that. And seeing that development of, kids coming to school always with a pretty rigid idea of what they wanted to do, whether it's superheroes or manga or underground or whatever. But being in New York and being surrounded by all this amazing culture and classmates from very different backgrounds, inevitably would just, by the end of their time there, would be opened up to whole new perspectives.
Yeah. And you were talking about this, or the expression, the people making these things. And it is unique because while the product is relatively narrow on the mainstream side of comic books, the people making it aren't. It was quite a diverse group of people. Skin color really didn't seem to be an issue. Sexual orientation, man, there were plenty of gay people that were just part of the network, and nobody thought twice. They were just, you were based basically on your skill sets. There were far fewer women at the time, for sure, and that is, I don't think it due to Marvel or DC. It was just the fandom of comic books really wasn't sort of as broad for all parties involved.
I think manga's really changed that. Like, we could notice that in the years that we were, we started at SVA in 2001 and left in 2012, and that kind of coincides with the exponential ramp up. Before that, in the 90s, people were reading some manga and some anime, and some of us saw stuff when we were kids. Depending on what city you grew up in, you might have seen, Simba the Lion or Ultraman or whatever. But it really wasn't at that kind of like peak saturation that started to happen in the early 2000s, where all this new stuff started to show up, and you had Viz and Tokyo Pop showing up and starting to print lots of stuff. And that we really saw that in the student body, that like from year to year, it went from something like 60-40 male female to par to, I think at this point, SVI might even be slightly more female than male students.
It's amazing.
Then there's the whole development in gender fluidity and stuff too. So that's a little asterisk on that binary there. But
we'll be flexible with our numbers in this point. But to me, it's a great thing, because I remember like when I got into the business, I mean, Amanda Connor just started in the business and like, and I was like, she could draw. Like, I was like,
Sure, yeah.
man, she just rocked, and she still rocks. So like, it really wasn't a matter of like anything, but like she just wanted to crush it, and she did. Yeah, love Amanda.
Yeah. Well, what's weird about SVA as an institution is that it's run very much, the model for the faculty, as you might know, is that the faculty are all supposed to be working artists and not like a faculty. So there's not faculty meetings. There's not, we have a very small cubby of an office where we can theoretically meet with students and stuff. But, I was there, like I said, for 11 years. And there are people that I never met or maybe met once in passing who taught not just in the illustration department, which was pretty big, but even within the cartooning department. I think I only actually met Phil Jimenez in person once or twice. We would have like emails together with the faculty, but it was, it's a strange model. And I see the wisdom of it and the idea that you want to have working professionals as your teachers, and you want to respect the time they need to work on their actual work. But it also makes it hard to create a cohesive kind of academic program and curriculum if teachers are kind of coming and going and no one's talking to each other, especially when you get to a point where you have Klaus Janson and Gary Panter teaching two different sections of what's supposed to be the same class. That's like
right.
Kind of quite an extreme, range of, and what we were all friends, everyone got along, but I'm just saying you want to make sure that like Gary and Klaus have like a conversation. It's like, what principles are you touching on? So at least, even if it's like a very different angle, it's coordinated in some extent. So there aren't like big gaps, So,
it's the nature of the whole thing. But I mean, but then again, I think you muddy the water if you try to make it some sort of institutional thing where, like in my mind's like, okay, well, could you have like 10% of the faculty be like, full-time teachers, but then they're the sort of the inside and the outside people, and then it becomes a problem. So
yeah, well, I mean, something like that though, you need to do like we do have like a cartooning coordinator that for a long time was Keith Mayerson. I don't know if he was around.
No, I don't think so.
Well, he wouldn't have been on when you were a student. He's closer to our age, but he's a painter and really into comics. And I think he basically created this position for itself and pitched it to Tom Woodruff, the department head, to give him like a little bit extra salary to be kind of a sort of point person for the comics curriculum that could sort of talk about what classes need to be in place, what needs to be, as digital technology starts coming in, we need a new studio, a new classroom with like Wacom tablets and then with iPads and so on. And Jason Little took over that job. And he's been doing that for the last 5 or 6 years now. So that's like one sort of like institutional link to trying to hold things together. But,
Yeah, well, I like that. I mean, I don't feel that there was anything like that when we were there, because I think it was just kind of the redheaded stepchild in the 80s. They just were focused on other things, I would say. Yeah.
And the fact that it's illustration and cartooning department was something we always, railed against a little bit. Even if, Tom Woodruff, who was very much an illustrator, he was very supportive of the comics and he understood. He would say that like the kids who are signing up for cartooning now are the kids who are signing up for painting in the 70s. They're like the weird kids who are like, looking for something new to do. And that's true. And I'm glad he saw that. But for example, there'd be like a master show. I don't know if this was the case when you were there, like like the junior show, the junior year, you do like a big portfolio project. And it was the whole thing was designed around oil painting illustration, which is like what Tom and a lot of the SVA faculty does. Right. So it was a really beautiful gallery space over on Chelsea. And all the illustration students come and have these beautiful, like giant, large scale watercolors and like, photographic collages and stuff. And then you got a bunch of freaking undergrad cartoonists with their like blue line paper pasted on the wall with pencils showing and stuff. And it looks like crap because it's not, comics pages are not meant to be presented that way,
Right.
It was always a conversation, and they understood that, but like there wasn't an obvious solution, which is basically it needs to be a publication. You should have illustration, should have their show, comics should have a book that comes out.
And that was Will Eisner's solution. So when he was teaching the class, the juniors got a book. So somebody from the senior class was the editor of that book, but the juniors so that junior class would produce a comic.
Oh,
so you got.
I didn't know that, because we talked about that and had lots of conversation about how that would work, and never managed to get it off the ground. I mean, there was maybe as a result of that, there was Ink Stains, which was the student anthology, which kind of which was an ongoing thing. That was a student group that they basically did on their own. But yeah, some kind of like workshop type of class. Because that's another thing that I learned living in France, is that European art schools in general have a very different approach to the curriculum. And it's much less linear and hierarchically structured. And it's much more like I've taught at the everywhere from, there's an art school in Angoulême that's got a very good comics program, which developed into like a studio program, which developed into an MFA program. And they're now actually offering a PhD in comics, which I think is a mixture of practice and theory and study. And I also taught up at the animation workshop, which is up in Viborg in the north of Denmark, which started as an animation school, obviously, but started a comics program about 10 years ago. And those schools don't have like a regular faculty that teaches you all semester. Instead, they have a kind of coordinator for each year. And every 2 weeks or so, you have a visiting teacher who comes in and basically does a 2-week workshop on a different theme, So in both those schools, actually, I did exercise and style as a kind of workshop. So we'd have 2 weeks to do, I think I just did 1 week in Viborg. And, we would come in, I would introduce my work and the idea of taking a single comic and redrawing it in different styles and point of view. And every day the kids would do a new variation. And we'd look at it, we'd critique it, we'd talk about it. In between, there'd be studio time. We'd all have meals together in the cafeteria. It's a very small town in the north of Denmark. And it's a little bit more discombobulated because you don't necessarily have like, we're building on these principles. But these days, comics and art education as a whole is like, people have so many disparate entry points and goals. It's very hard to teach, like when I started teaching at SVA, I was like very adamant, like, you're going to learn how to use a nib pen and how to use a number 2 watercolor brush. And we're going to use waterproof, India ink. And, maybe I'll teach you how to do an ink wash, but beyond that, like that's all you need for comics, and by the time I left, it was just like, well, yeah, sure. Use a Wacom, if you've got a tablet, tell me what you're using. I want to learn how to use technology myself. Definitely learning as much from my students, in terms of technology, by the end of my time there. So, which is just to say that kind of more open-ended approach that's like workshop based, can be really beneficial, because even if it sucks, it's only 2 weeks and you're always going to get something out of it. And having a sort of constant rotation of new ideas and new input, new assignments, I think is a really great way to go about learning art in particular,
Yeah, for sure.
Thinking on your feet and not getting bogged down in the sense of, one crisis I had, like I taught for 11 years full-time undergrad and continuing ed, like more than full-time. I sort of burned myself out. And one problem I had was that this sense of like, why, how can I do like a 15-week, semester where I'm teaching, whatever it is, principles of storytelling or how to draw in ink. How can I really reach every single student and give them what they need? Some of these kids have no interest in the kind of storytelling you're like conventional storytelling, or they already have their own kind of mindset that they're coming from. And it becomes kind of like an exercise in futility after a while, and a waste of time to a certain extent. Whereas if you're like switching it up more often, you find more ways for especially like, reluctant kids who are either really shy or sometimes kids who are hotshots and think they know it all and they need to have someone come in and blow them away, again, it comes from all directions. So, not that I think, American art schools are going to change that model anytime soon. Because that would call for a complete overhaul of the way art schools are run. But
yeah, well, it's what's interesting. I mean, to me, it sounds like a sort of a series of master classes. You're getting a master class,
exactly.
Just dialed up. Here you go. You're going to get a lot of stuff coming across the thing. But I was thinking about like what you were doing in the discussion of style. And thinking about how style is such a personalized element in the arts. I mean, we really, aside from session players and music, style is like, this is my thing. This is the thing that I've created, and I'm going to shut everything else out in the world in that sense. So how did you overcome that, I would assume, level of reluctance to try to break one's style for your course?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and you see it most clearly because they're more conventionalized style and kids who are really into mainstream superhero style or like a very hardcore manga style, whether it's shoujo or whatever. And the thing is when I teach exercise and style, which is, based on a French book that I made a comic book version of, the idea of taking a single short story and retelling it numerous times. Style can mean a lot of different things. So sometimes, yes, I'm going to say, you're into manga. I want you to draw this next. Sometimes I will actually confront them directly with say, like, I know you're drawing manga style all the time. Next comic, I want you to draw it like in the style of Robert Crumb. I'll give them a bunch of Robert Crumb comics or something, or Julie Doucet, and say like, here, draw this in a Julie Doucet style. But then there's also stuff where it's like, all right, we're going to draw it in a different genre or for a different point of view. So style is more than just the drawing, which I think is part of the idea of style is really the totality of the tools you have as a storyteller, So there are people who have just one drawing style, but they have enormous variety of styles in the way they approach storytelling. I think about like Louis Trondheim or Jason, the Norwegian cartoonist, who's done a bunch of books with Banner Graphics. They both have a very simple, recognizable drawing style that hasn't really changed much since they sort of settled on it in the early 2000s or even the 90s. But they find ways to tell really different kinds of stories with them, from mysteries to fantasy epics to humorous stuff to autobio, and that becomes the way that they express different varieties of style, within a recognizable, plastic style.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time when we're young, especially a lot of cartoonists, copying cartoons that we like.
Sure.
So that sense of style, borrowed style or infused style, is, I guess, kind of baked in. And that maybe it's
certainly where. Yeah, I mean, I didn't go to art school. I studied comp lit, and when I started getting into drawing, it was really a lot of my self education was just like doing line for line copies of George Harriman, of the Hernandez brothers, of Julie Doucet drawings, of Dan Clowes, and then Hergé and Mobius and all this kind of stuff, trying to learn how they did it, and then. In addition to the whole exercise and style thing, one aspect of that is copying styles. That's something I enjoy a lot. When I would teach an ink drawing class, I would always do what I call a forgery assignment, where I would assign people not just to draw something that looks a little bit like, a Karl Barks drawing, but to like do some research, find out what kind of pen did he use, what size did he draw at, which is really important, I think, in terms of really getting into the hand of someone, and to make a drawing that's going to be so faithful technically and stylistically to the whatever artist you're copying that you could go on eBay and sell it as a forgery. I don't think anyone ever actually did that. I made clear that was just an academic, conceit
exercise. Yes.
But yeah, I think it's when you really get into that level of detail, it's not going to change you overnight, but it gives you some insight into, at the very least, it humanizes it, like art that looks like totally impossible to, like an Edward Gorey drawing or something like that. When you look into it, if you can get a chance to actually go to a gallery and look at an original drawing, that's always really amazing too. And you can look at it and say, oh, I see where he'd make corrections here. And, you get a sense of the human hand doing even, I don't know, like a Jeff Darrow drawing or something like that, stuff that's like totally insane looking. It still has a human scale to it that you can learn about, whether that becomes part of your own style or not, it isn't even really that important. It's part of your education as an artist, and learning how to look and how to get a sense of scale
and communicate. And listen, you're also trying to become a professional in this world. And part of the job of professionals are to be able to communicate different things. And yeah, I mean, listen, I've been asked many times, can you make it look like this?
Right.
Well,
yeah, sure. Absolutely. Okay. And that plays into like when I, in terms of like kids who have a really set drawing style, I'm not going to try and break them of their style because that's what they love to do. Right. And frankly, it is going to be a marketing asset for them if that's what, if they are trying to do, a manga or superhero stuff, or, they want to draw like the next Chris Ware or something. Mm-hmm. There are people who just they've like, this is how I've got my visual thing worked out. I'm like, that's fine, but you can still find ways to tweak that visually to make it more your own, to see how you can expand and contract it, in different ways. But I definitely, as like my own work, Exercise in Style, Ex Libris, I sink a huge amount of time into just, I draw 3 pages in one style, and then it's like, all right, I got to come up with a whole new style. Whether it's, sometimes a lot of times in both those books, I'm imitating or doing homage or a bit of a parody of existing styles. But it still means a couple of days of, getting out books to look at and drawing in my sketchbook and working stuff out. There's definitely just a practical as well as a marketing value, to having a clear, simple style that you can do quickly, you can produce on demand without too much preparation and just get drawing. I really admire that. And I'm always hoping that I'm going to just back into a style like that. And we'll suddenly have like 3 books over my shoulder and be like, oh, I guess I've come up with my working style finally.
Sure.
But in my case, the larger aspects of like what you can do with shifts in style and drawing style and registers of storytelling, I find so fun to play around with that I keep on going down these rabbit holes. And that might just be part of my artistic project that I'm, doomed to, continue.
It might be your style,
Yeah,
your style might be doing
my
that.
style is unfortunately this very labor intensive style of, constantly morphing into other stuff. But
well, for Ex Libris, how did you plot out the entirety of this? Because for people who haven't read it, I mean, this is a story that changes the visual and narrative storytelling process, yet maintaining a through line throughout through the entirety of the piece. So there's sort of kind of like multiple things happening at once in sections of this book, which is great. But like, did you sit down and go, okay, here's my idea for the story. Now, did you like really have to plot out like, okay, I really wanted to have this kind of vibe, this kind of vibe, this kind of vibe leading to something at the end? Or are you just riffing?
Yeah. I mean, basically there was like a push and pull between, this notion. I like little short stories and fragments that are, self-referential in one way or another. And I'd already done a lot of them or had ideas for a lot of stories like that. So I already had a lot of this kind of stuff. And at some point, I came up with this idea for a larger story about a character who would be reading through these books, and the book would be, entering in a sort of narrative dialogue and in some sense, drawing them into their action and sending them on to the next, part of the story. So, so there were these two. There was a larger structure of like, I had an idea of a character who's in a room. At some point I decided it would be, characters sort of locked in a room with a bookshelf full of comics, and they're reading these comics. And I just had a general idea that they need to like learn something from these comics, like to figure out some way to get out of the room by the end of the book. Mm-hmm. That gave me sort of a narrative, almost like a thriller, psychological thriller like arc, which would be hopefully be satisfying for a reader who just wants to read a tale. There's a push and pull in my work and the kind of work I like between telling a story and fulfilling the traditional kind of 3-act Western plot structure stuff, and stuff that's more experimental, that's non-linear, that isn't really concerned with narrative as much as either experimenting with form or being more essayistic or impressionistic or like ambient storytelling or something like that. So in some ways this book is a way to have it both ways, attempt to have it both ways, where I built this structure that's narrative, and then I have all these ideas for more playful experimental ideas about comics. And then it kind of became a matter of sort of looking at, spreading them all out and figuring out how they built on each other, how one story might plant an idea that could be developed in a later story. I'm trying to think if there's a simple illustration I can give without too many spoilers from the book, but so, within the various fragments that are in Ex Libris, and there's some, I guess there's maybe 4 or 5 full, like start to finish stories. And then a lot of things where you're reading like either like one page or even a few panels out of a larger book, but they make sense because you're reading them within the context of, all this sort of collage narrative that I've put together. Mm-hmm. And several of those had existed independently. I'd already drawn them. And when I started thinking about this structure, I was like, I can reuse these. One sort of goal of this book was to create, to sneak a short story collection onto the market, because publishers hate doing short story collections. I love short stories. Everyone loves short stories. I don't know why it's such a big deal, but you talk to any publisher, any agent, any editor, as soon as you mention a short story collection, they just turn pale and they're like, no, do a novel, do a graphic novel, do whatever, do a memoir. So, so this was a way to graft a short story collection into a larger narrative in some sense. And ironically, because the book came out and it did well, Uncivilized Books, my next book with them will be actually finally a short story collection of a lot of other short stories I've done over the last 20 years or so. So that'll hopefully be coming out in 2024.
Oh, cool.
But
no, it is the thing that you think about. When you think short story collection or developing an anthology, like how do you make this thing interesting enough that someone's going to say, hey, I'm going to take a risk on this, Yeah. So the model for the anthology is like, well, can we get somebody famous to do one piece in here so we can make sure that somebody's going to buy it? So you see a lot of Neil Gaiman short stories and collections because they know they can move the material.
Yeah. Well, it's even harder when it's a one person omnibus. There's a collection of your own work,
Right.
And there's a not great tradition in comics publishing, in indie comics publishing, I find especially, of like putting together these sort of grab bag collections of like, especially, an author who's like got a little bit of renown. You put together a book that's like every little short thing they've done, including like a few illustration gigs. You throw in a couple of pages of sketchbook stuff, some doodle stuff here and there,
an essay or two written by somebody else about them.
Yeah. So I'm trying my collection this is not finalized and we haven't even signed a contract, so I shouldn't talk about this too much, but the collection I've been working on, I've been trying to sell it for a few years, which is be a collection of they're very different stories in content, but they all share my interest in formal constraints. So like I send you a copy of Bridge, this short story that I did, and Bridge will probably be the sort of anchor story of that collection. But I have several, in that story, was done as a 24-hour comic initially. I redrew it to make it look better, but I had that time constraint of having to come up with a whole story of 24 pages in 24 hours. But more importantly for me was the added constraint that every page 10 years have to pass from one page to the next. So the story takes place over a course of 240 years in a very short, 24 pages. And the storytelling challenge for me then became, how do I tell a story? Am I going to tell a story about a vampire, or like, how do I bridge that amount of time? Do I do a family saga? And I ended up coming up with this sort of 3-part structure that I was really pleased with. And
it's a great way to handle that sort of constraint.
Yeah. I mean, constraints are a real keyword for me. In fact, you can see on this poster behind me that says "Freedom and Constraint," which is
there you go.
the name of an exhibit that I curated when we were living in France about this group called Ubapo, which I'm associated with, which is the Workshop for Potential Comics, and it's a group of cartoonists that work with constraints and rules as a way to challenge ourselves to make new comics. So I've done a lot of work in this vein. It comes out of Exercise and Style. So that comic was inspired by a book by a French author named Raymond Queneau, who wrote a book called Exercise and Style in 1947, I think it came out. And it's the same basic principle. It's a short text that he tells 99 times in different styles, different points of view. And in 1960, he founded a group called Oulipo, the Workshop for Potential Literature, which looked for game-like structures like that to generate new types of literature. Like he created a book called 100 Million Sonnets, and it's actually just 10 sonnets. But he figured out that those chimera animal books where you have like the head and the midsection, and you can mix the lion and the elephant and so on. He applied that principle to the sonnet, so that gives you 14 flaps, right? Because there's 14 lines in a sonnet. And so you write 10 sonnets, that gets you 10 to the 14 power, which is a 1 with 14 zeros after it. That's the number of poems it generates, which is more poems than you can read in like something like 50 lifetimes. It's impossible to read. So there was that conceptual idea of creating a book of poetry that's literally unreadable, in multiple lifetimes. And also, how do you compose 10 sonnets on separate strips in such a way that no matter how you recombine them, they will still rhyme, because it follows the sonnet structure. Because it's in French, it has to be a correspondence in the masculine and the gender of the nouns, if they're masculine or feminine, and so on, and that it more or less works as a poem. Which in my lifetime of knowing this book, I'll pick it up every couple of years and read a few sonnets, and they always make sense. They always work. They're often very witty and funny. And so that was, again, that kind of creative challenge that really inspired him, that had this sort of conceptual angle, but also this creative challenge. Like, can I really create, this modular poem, that can be read any possible way?
Yeah.
So that kind of idea is a real spark to all of my creativity. And you see less of it directly in Ex Libris, but it's definitely behind that whole work as well. This sort of setting myself a task and trying to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, it is something that we have this sort of internal desire to kind of create from, whole cloth, early on in our life, where we go, hey, I have this agency, this pen is in my hand, or this instrument is in my hands, and I'm going to make something that no one's ever seen before. And a lot of times we spend a lot of that staring at blankness, because there's nothing to kind of push against. There's nothing to kind of feel against. And then when, if you're using your skill sets in the commercial aspect, all you have is constraints. You have time, you have budget, you have clients, and they have their needs and wishes. And so you have to kind of contend with all this stuff. But yet what makes something unique out in the world is that people can connect to this thing. But it's those constraints that the creators are put under. They go, okay, how do we solve this? How do we make this thing something that we can all go home and sleep well, knowing we did this work?
Yeah.
And it's work. It's not just like, I made something and pat me on the back, off I go. Like this is our livelihood. It's the thing that drives us. So
exactly. Yeah.
These are important. So
and they exist they exist in all levels of creativity as well, not just commercial art, but just, if you want to make a comic book, you have all these pre-existing constraints in terms of like the page format. If you're working in a commercial, mode, you've got deadlines and, you've got to be able to work with, and there, and traditionally you had like limits in what kind of colors you could use. I mean, the whole reason we have the sort of classic American drawing style we have is because, Milt Caniff and all these guys were drawing for newsprint, and they had to draw, nice thick lines that would like reproduce in really crappy circumstances, otherwise they might have been drawing really delicate, spindly lines and pencil, stuff, as you can now, because it's much easier to do stuff online, and even to print at higher quality than it was, in the 40s and 50s, say. So whether you want to believe that art is about, total freedom and you just have to have inspiration, the fact is there's always all these constraints, that are already, constraining you, and becoming aware of them, I think, is a kind of freedom in itself. Just being aware that, like, yes, I have a deadline. Yes, there's a format I have to follow. Yes, even, I want to tell a story. Therefore I have to, pay some homage to Robert McKee or whatever it's going to be. Those are there whether you like it or not. And then what I like to do is then add an extra kind of absurdist constraint on top of that, which perversely, by making it even more difficult and boxed in, it really, it's that gauntlet. It, like you said, as an artist, it pushes you to make that very personal response, the solution that you're going to come up with, which you don't know what it's going to be until you do it. With Bridge, I started that evening without any idea that I was going to write the story that I wrote, which is this kind of almost like a Twilight Zone kind of weird. It's a story I like to read. I like to read it almost like someone else wrote it, because it just sort of came out of me, not out of inspiration. I do think there's I think, when people hear me talk about constraints and they hear about this group Oulipo, they think, well, it sounds like, like computer art or something like that. And it's not really, because it's really about setting aside all the other misconceptions about, inspiration and freedom, and thinking that something's going to come whole cloth into your mind. It's actually really about wrestling with the materials at hand, that will really, squeeze some new insight out of you that does come out of, in the end, is a kind of inspiration. I think it's a kind of like using your own intuition. Like I don't believe in inspiration, but I believe a lot in a kind of artist's intuition. When I have some weird constraint in front of me, how am I going to tell this story where 10 years pass and every page, there's sure, I can see there's a numerical thing going on there. I can't just rely on the muse and inspiration, because I got to follow this rule. So what I have to do instead is like wrestle with this time constraint that I have. And also, both in terms of like, I have to do 10 years every page. I also have to finish this thing in 24 hours.
Sure. Right.
I really have to trust my intuition and my experience and my taste as an artist and a storyteller to just start doodling. And, that's what I did. I made charts. I drew out little graphs. All right, 10 years. How does this work out? Until I started to get these ideas, and then these little things pop, and this idea fits with that idea, and they start to all come together. And then there's this amazing moment of like solving a difficult chess problem or something, where it's it all comes into focus. Not always, it's experimental, so it can also fall flat. The year after I originally drew, or I will say, created Bridge in 2013 in Angoulême, when we used to do a 24-hour comics event the night before the comics festival starts, which they stopped doing during the pandemic. But the year after this, I drew Bridge. I went to another one of these events, and I drew something. I mean, I sketched for 24 hours. I think about 18 hours, and I gave up. And I still have an unfinished thing lying around, and I still have this vague idea of like, maybe I can salvage this into something. But, frankly, it failed as an experiment,
Yeah.
You just don't know going into it. So I think that's an important aspect of art too, is like, being willing to try something and just totally flunk it,
Yeah. I mean, my wife is an artist, and I watch her wrestle with that all the time, because she's almost kind of unwilling to accept defeat on anything. So she will just.
What's her medium? Does she have, medium? What's her medium of choice?
Well, she was a sculptor for the predominant time of the, that we've been together. So over 20 years. But, when she went off to Ireland, she didn't want to bring sculpture to or from. Yeah. So she said, I'm going to do watercolors. So she just dragged paper and paint. And so she's been doing watercolors, but she's not doing watercolors like humans do watercolors. She's like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to paint this stuff, and then I'm going to cut it apart, and then I'm going to sew it all back together. And like, okay, sure. But like she'll do things, and I'll look at it and be like, well, I don't know if that's completely successful, because she's not happy with it. I'm not saying this as sort of like, I don't know. And then she'll just go like, yeah, but I'll figure it out. Like she, and it's not even that she says she'll figure it out. She just goes like, and she just bludgeons on forward through this thing. And
when I say that experiments can be failures, that doesn't mean that they necessarily need to be walk away from. Because you can, like I said, this one that I did, I still have it in a folder, and I still carry it around with me, thinking like, at some point I'm going to pull this out, and I think I'll come up with an idea to make it cohere into something. And I think almost any creative project is salvageable, and I've observed it a lot in my own work, especially on individual drawings, because I'm not a natural draftsman the way some people are. I really need to like do a lot of tracing and work up my drawings until I'm happy with them. And there are definitely various times where I'm just like, I can't do this drawing. It's always going to look terrible. And sometimes I'll put it away for a few weeks and go move on to other stuff. And I come back to it and I work on it some more. And eventually, sometimes I amaze myself. I'm like, wow, I nailed it. More often, it's like I get to the next stage and I'm like, all right, maybe it's not exactly what I was looking for, but like
I'll live with this.
It achieves what I set out for in the context of the work. So I think that's a really key thing about being an artist. Actually, is knowing that a piece of art is never finished, but also knowing you have to stop at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing for the last, I don't know, however many, 5-6 years, and novel writing. And, I've come to the conclusion, like a book isn't done until your publisher takes it away from you. Like Absolutely, there is because unless someone takes it away from you, you're just going to keep going, oh, wait, I know how to solve that scene better. Yeah. I know how to do this better, or whatever the thing is, which I know people that this type of behavior plagues their creative career. They don't ever move. They don't move forward. They just live in this cyclical thing. Like, well, I can fix that. I can fix that.
Yeah. Well, Walt Whitman pretty famously is considered to have like largely ruined many editions of Leaves of Grass, because in his case, it was actually published. And then he would go back in to the manuscript like, no, I will redo this, going to reshuffle this stuff, write some new material. And I don't know, during his lifetime, there's like, 10 different editions of Leaves of Grass. And at this point, most scholars and readers agree like the second one was the best. After that, he started making it worse. It's like, just let it go and move on to something else,
Well, it's like, I mean, you and I being the same age, like there's that thing of like, we were of that Star Wars generation, and like, and then like arguably the most successful sort of cinematic venture. And this guy goes, I can still make it probably better. I'm like, you didn't, but cool. It's just one of these kind of things. Like there is like, we should take our hands off the thing. Like, okay, time, hands up, like move along, make something new.
Yeah, for sure.
I just want to go back to Ex Libris just a little longer. Because you have such a variety of work in there, I'm assuming you had a lot of variety of tools and materials you use to achieve the book?
Mm-hmm. A fair amount, although to be honest, the vast majority of the book was drawn in India ink on Bristol board with, one of 2 or 3 favorite, nibs that I use, just like your basic Hunt 102. I haven't gotten stuff out in a while here. Let's see what I got. I got one of these mechanical pencils because I saw, Squeakin, the Belgian cartoonist, doing he does these amazing architectural drawings. Let me get that in focus here. And I just loved the fact that he could just draw for a while, and then you got this little, you can lower the lead and you sharpen it in this funny little doohickey. It's a really pleasing ritual. I'm not sure it's faster or better than just using a regular pencil, but I just like that.
I think I drew probably 90% of my comic books with a pencil like that.
So yeah, it's nice to have rituals that make it it's like a green tea ceremony. You want to find ways to make it enjoyable. So yeah, your basic Hunt 102 with just I put a little kids rubber pencil holder for my weary fingers. And then I use a brush. This is a really ratty old Raphael number 4. At some point, Jessica and I decided we need to have really thick. I can't remember who told us that, but someone was like, "Yeah, use a number 4 watercolor brush because you can get really fine lines if it's a Klinsky Sable, and you can also get that. I like a big chunky fat brush line too." And I was amazed to learn years later that Paul Pope uses a 000. He's a tiny little brush, but he has this amazing black fields of black ink in his comics. But he draws everything with this tiny little brush. It's hilarious. So,
funny.
So yeah, it really is a lot of pen, and the color. The sort of main color, there's a lot of blue. There's sort of a blue tone in there. Is a mixture of ink wash, which I then scan and tint it in Photoshop, and some flat color as well. I'm trying to think if I really used other tools very much. There's with the color effects, there's a fair amount of stuff done in Photoshop.
That horror comic section was really well colored.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, that's all. I've done iterations of that over the years, dating back to Bizarro Comics number 2, which remember that DC Comics did these things. And my wife did a comic with Dylan Horrocks in there about Supergirl. And that got me into, and they had me color it. And then they liked what I did with it and invited me to do, and a bunch of my friends were in there too. Dean Haspiel, Nick Bertozzi, Tom Hart, Megan Kelso, and Ellen Forney all had comics in there. So I ended up coloring for all of them. And one of them actually, Evan Dorkin and Dean Haspiel had a parody of Shazam. And we wanted to make it look like an old 4-color newsprint book. So I did some research and figured out how to kind of reproduce the big dot coloring. Because the problem with coloring technology, it's almost too good. You can't get that. You can't organically get that crappy color anymore. You have to recreate it artificially. So with XLeap, so I've done it a few times over the year. It's a little gimmicky. You don't want to overdo it. I did it in Exercise and Style as well, but I'm pretty pleased with how it works out on here because I refined the technique a little bit so that I noticed when you look at those old comic books, not only are there the dots and they're, off register, but on the plate, let's see, very the red here. Yeah. Very, very often the ink kind of pools up at the bottom of the field. Totally. So I just did that, the blue especially. So I'll do stuff like that where I would just go in with a smudge tool and create that sort of, so it's all done digitally, but it turned out pretty well.
Right, because you can't make that happen. So you have to, have to fake it.
Like I said, I don't know the kind of printing press and color separation you would need to actually print that way. Weirdly, it's probably very hard to find now.
Most likely they were all smashed up and recycled for material. It'd be cool if newsprint comic publishing
circa 1950 became like a boutique thing like Risographs or something. Some people set up some old printing presses like that, and we're just running off, badly off-register, cheap newsprint pamphlet comics again. That'd be cool.
My inner 12-year-old would be there buying those. That is, it's like, what did I can't remember what I wrote the other day, but it's just, there's this sort of this dull, keening pain of reality as you see your life turned into nostalgia. Mm-hmm. You're like, oh, okay. Like, this is now everybody else out there goes, oh, this is so nostalgic. You're like, oh, okay, great.
Yeah, absolutely. That becomes more and more acute year by year.
Yeah, totally. It's just the way it happens. What's your writing process like when you sit down? Like, I mean, how do you collect? How do you develop? How do you put everything together?
Yeah. Well, I don't write a script, I think is the main difference I have from a lot of cartoonists and certainly writers for comics. Instead, I, the development stage, which is very long, I'm a very slow kind of plodding worker in terms of developing ideas. I'll have notes, which I'll keep either in a sketchbook or increasingly like on my computer. I use Evernote, which I found to be really good for just like storing, I may just make a notebook with all notes related to a particular story. And I can also save, articles that are related to it or clip art in there, or even, drop in voice memos or whatever. And as and again, as I often start from a constraint, I usually will start with some kind of concept like that. Like another book that I did a few years ago was called Drawn Onward. It was published by Retrofit. It will also be reprinted in my short story collection. And it has a very difficult constraint, took me years to figure out, which is that it's basically a palindromic story. So the layout of the first page is the same as the layout of the last page.
Right.
And it's a kind of twisted love story. And there's two characters who meet and they kiss right in the middle of the book. And then, so their paths are sort of heading towards this kiss, and then they start to diverge in this, visually symmetrical way, but that needs to also tell a story through there. So that involved just lots of like doodles and sketches and making little dummies of the book and just trying to, I guess there's a lot of, when there's some kind of formal reading path aspect to it, I'll have, lots of little printouts and thumbnails. Instead of scripting, I learned this thing from Jessica, who learned it from Alison Bechtel, which is that Alison, when she was working on Fun Home, developed this kind of like ad hoc system of, she was using Illustrator, I think, or maybe I think she was doing Adobe Illustrator.
Okay.
And what we showed her InDesign was actually better adapted for this. But basically, you create a whole mock-up of the book in a design program like InDesign. And what's great is that you can then have all your pages in there. You can divide your panels, a grid if you can preset it. I tend to work in a grid. So Ex Libris is, like a 6-panel grid. I usually do 6 or 9 panels as a starting point, at least. You can just lay that all in there and you can start typing dialogue in there and text descriptions. So it's kind of like a visual script.
Yeah.
And what's great is that, what's important for me is that the reason I don't like to write like a screenplay type of script is that one of the most important storytelling tools of comics is the spread and the page turn, and where things appear on the page in relation to each other and to the rest of the book. So, a story where it's like literally a mirror. You can't write a screenplay for that. You have to be able to look at it. So when you're writing visually, in a layout or in a little booklet, because sometimes I'll just have like tiny little thumbnail. You can do like templates that I find like DeviantArt is still out there. It's like, I feel like that was like in the early 2000s, all my students were on there, and I don't know if they are anymore, but what I have found is useful for is a lot of artists share templates for stuff and like, brushes for Photoshop and things like that. So you can find little templates that are like little mini thumbnails for like a 24-page book or something like that. So sometimes that that small, just like doing tiny little doodles to get the pacing of the story. So it's always a back and forth, and the writing, the actual like narration and dialogue comes comparatively late in the game. Once I have a sense of like how long it's going to be, and once I'm sure I can place that stuff on a page, because a conversation, depending on the visual storytelling, could happen on one page, but you might start laying it out and say like, oh, I really got to get this taken care of in like 2 panels so I can have room for this visual stuff that needs to happen. Or you might realize, oh wait, you know what, this could actually be like a 3-page thing, because then it would lead up to a page turn, which leads to, you know, some revelation or whatever. So it's a little bit of a chore to set up. But at this point, I have like a template set up, and I just get my InDesign set up. And basically that InDesign document slowly becomes the final book, because as I draw doodles or even like have reference photos, I can just drop them into the InDesign. And I get a sense of how it's developing. I'll print that out and I'll trace it and do, you know, final drawing, scan it back in, and slowly the book, you know, evolves that way. So that pretty much that same, what started as a kind of thumbnail writing document becomes the final document that I send to the publisher in the end.
Yeah, I love
so it's
that.
a very dynamic way, and you can move pages around, and you know, it's just it's a really very modular and very editable, but very visually focused form of writing, I think.
No, I think it's beautiful. I mean, I love InDesign, but I love the way you're using it. That's a really, it's really flexible.
Yeah. I think it's good. Because it keeps you from the issue of like writing out a big script and then having to break it down, and you know, you end up, I don't know, possibly cramming stuff in because you're running out of room on the page, and I don't know, it just it bypasses that aspect of the writing.
It's amazing how valuable our tools are, and not the tool specifically, but how we modify the tools that we use. Like making the tool work for us becomes part of that creative process, becomes part of that constraint.
Sure.
We have to kind of work around, you know, like, I mean, if you're like, hey, I can't get to I'm away and there's no way I'm going to be able to replace this brush, but it's got that really weird thing where it starts making that double split line. Mm-hmm. How do I make that work for me? Like, I got to figure out how to make that work, because that's just the thing. And inevitably that could become the look that you like. But, yeah, you know, you have to kind of work with these kind of, I don't know, these kinks to make the kinks kind of be cool.
For sure. I mean, part of finding your voice beyond just like whatever your style and kind of the genre you like is like, you know, we all have a sort of physiological aspect of the way we draw, a little wobble to our line, mm-hmm. or a tendency to like draw heads leaning a certain way, or, you know, a really thick line. And that's, you know, maybe it's something that at first we think like, I got to get rid of that. But then eventually you have to realize that's like part of your style.
Right.
And it's what makes your stuff your own unique expression.
Well, it's funny. I was looking at some lettering in your books, and I was thinking, is he left-handed? Because I'm thinking it was hand-done lettering, you know. And I'm like, because the slant of the uprights, I was like, that looks like a left-handed writing style. But I think they're all digitally
it is a font based on my left-handed writing style. So yeah.
Oh, okay. So there you go. So I mean, like,
I am lefty. You are correct. And
okay.
And there's a fair amount of hand lettering in the book and in the sort of shorter stories. But the main font that you see throughout the book is a font based on my lettering.
Very cool.
I'm really pleased with at this point. And actually, it does look pretty convincing as a organic lettering. It's got several alternates for shape, so you don't get too much repetition. It's a little bit of a Frankenstein monster, but I've developed it over the years and sent it back to various people to, you know, whenever I get a new publisher, I'm like, especially foreign publishers, you know, I have like, oh, can you add this different accent shape? And
right.
They usually do that stuff for me. So.
For anybody who hasn't read the book, go out, you know, get Ex Libris. There's a really great sequence in there on like in real time on lettering. It's very, very cool. Like that whole section of creating their own comic book and the lettering. It was really, really fun to read. So
thanks.
Yeah, I dug that. So what's the timeline? What's happening with like, what are people going to be able to take a look at the new stuff or any of the,
well, new stuff, not anytime soon, but, Ex Libris is actually almost sold out of its first print run.
Wow. Congratulations.
Supposedly in China being reprinted right now. It's not gone yet. You can still find it. But there will be a new printing showing up by the spring, I think. The French edition is officially launching in February, but I'll be going to Angoulême next week to do a sort of pre-launch signing at the Association booth, my French publisher. They've also done an edition of Bridge, and they years ago they did my exercise and style book, so I'll have like a full spread of stuff to sell.
That's great.
And sign in Angoulême. In terms of my short story collection is slated for spring 24. Handshake agreement. Like I said, We haven't signed anything. I'm still holding out for the off chance that, because I basically have it ready to go. I would need a week or two of hard work of just, crossing the T's and dotting the I's and all that. But, it could be made ready to go. So I'm hoping someone gets, behind schedule and has to drop out of the fall slate. That actually happened to me with Ex Libris. Ex Libris would have come out later, but because Tom Kaczynski, bought it in February, and I figured, well, it's going to be spring. Spring. It would have come out this spring 21. But as it happened, he had an author who was supposed to deliver in the fall of 20, and who couldn't, make the deadline. Family stuff had come up, so he was able to slot me in earlier, and I was able to. The book came out in October of 2020.
That's amazing.
So it's getting a bit late for that to happen for me with my short story collection, but it's all right. In the meantime, I've been pretty busy. Just Ex Libris with doing talks like this, which has been a lot of fun. I've also been doing a little bit more teaching than usual in the last year. I've taken kind of a long break since my SVA years. And when we were in France, I did a lot of teaching at different schools around France and, of course, up in Denmark at the animation workshop. But in April, I'm really excited. I'm going to get to go to the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, where I'm running a 2-week comics residency. It's going to be me and my friend Bishak Song, who's a really great cartoonist. And she and I are going to be the faculty. But again, it's kind of on this European model that we were talking about before, where it's really a open workshop. We're going to have 14 residents from Canada and from all over the world. And they will come and work on comics projects. We're not really teaching. We're going to be on hand to talk about our work and be there to answer questions and, check in on people periodically. And we'll be working on our own comics, I hope. And, I do have two new book ideas that I'm kind of sort of banging my head against and see which one cracks the shell first before I can, commit to it more long term and start talking about it. But I do have a few projects I want to do next in comics. The Banff, I don't know how soon you're going live on this, but the deadline for the Banff residency is January 25th. Okay. So if we're live before then, I can give you the link to check that out.
I'll put it in the description.
Yeah, I'm also going to be teaching a class on constraints, like we were talking about earlier. If that kind of stuff interests you, I'm going to do a 4-session workshop. It's going to be Saturdays. It's going to be online through the Sequential Artists Workshop, which is Tom Hart's comic school that he started after he left as teaching SVA in around 2010, and is now mostly an online school. So that'll be that's going to be in March, I want to say. The Banff residency, by the way, is the last 2 weeks of April is when the actual residency is. So those are two standalone things. And then the other thing I started doing, what we were talking about when we were setting up earlier, is that I've been doing one-on-one comics coaching, for people who are not necessarily a beginner cartoonist, but people who are already working on comics and are maybe stuck in a project or just want some feedback on a long-term basis. And that's something I'm just doing sort of baby steps, but I started in the fall with a few clients, and it's been pretty rewarding. It came out of work I did actually also at the Sequential Artist Workshop, where they have a 1-year program, and I come in once a year and act as a sort of mentor over a couple weeks while they're working on their final projects. And it's more of a group setting, but people just show their work, and we do a little quick critique, talk about troubleshooting, but talk about also more generally about like getting into the comics world. And I have this like weird background where I come out of mini comics and indie stuff, but I've also done coloring for Marvel and DC, and I've written. We didn't even get into talking about the textbooks that Jessica and I did, drawing words and writing pictures, and Mastering Comics, which were published by First Second back at the 2000. Like alongside our children, 2007 and 2008 and 2012. Our kids were born in 2007 and 2010. So, okay. Speaking of the InDesign scripting method, we do talk about that in Mastering Comics. I think has a little section on that, so you can look that one up. I'll send you the links.
Cool.
But Jessica and I were also the series editors of the Best American Comics. Anyway, I'm just doing my CV here, but yeah. So it's like I've been an editor, been an artist, but basically, primarily I'm an artist. Like the last few years have been really great for me because through the 2000s, I was doing so much stuff, teaching full time and doing these textbooks and a lot of other, comics adjacent work, that I started to kind of lose my self identity as a cartoonist. I started to become afraid I was going to be, that guy who did that Exercise and Style book back, in the early 2000s.
Sure.
And since Ex Libris and Bridge came out, and also Drawn Onward, which, was 2015 or so, I feel like I've, hit the ground running again, and I'm back on as a, cartoonist primarily, who occasionally does other stuff. But one of those things is coaching. So people that are interested in getting some feedback from, a fellow professional, that's something that I'm doing now. So I can give you some links for that.
Yeah, I'll put all that stuff, everything you give me, I'll put it in the description, so people can get in touch with you one way or the other, or follow you on Instagram. And or whatever you prefer.
In terms of socials, Instagram is really my main place I interact. I'm lurking on Twitter and Facebook. I don't really interact either of those places very often, but except I can't remember if I met you through Twitter or Instagram. I think it was
Instagram.
There was some little flurry of interest in 99 Ways to Tell a Story, which occasionally gets, endlessly gratifying because that book came out in 2005. But I still, bubbles up every once in a while. Someone will discover it or just decide they want to share how much they love that book with the world.
People still buy Robert McKee stuff. So,
Exactly. Yeah. I got 99. That's just one story. I got 99 of them. So,
Right. Exactly. So take that, McKee. Yeah. I think if you make foundational pieces, everybody's looking, like if you make bricks, people are always looking to build their own foundation. So you're going to have customers forever. Mm-hmm. That's my theory. I just made it up.
I hope so. Yeah. It's been an interesting journey from that book. And it plays into what I was just saying, I think, in that, I think what makes it worked ultimately is that I did it as an artist and not, even though I'm already an educator and was teaching, I didn't do that book to be a pedagogical tool. I did it as a creative exercise. And when I started it, I had no intention. I had no idea that it was going to get even published as a book, much less be, now in its 22nd printing, which is, amazing. But it's not, I could have made it a more practical thing and had lesson plans and stuff like that. But I did it just as on its own. And so it has a kind of you discover it and you figure out what you're going to do with it, I guess, is an aspect that I think people react to with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the less prescriptive something can be, the greater the opportunity for application.
I think so, yeah, because, I hear from people in all kinds of different media that have used it. Definitely a lot of filmmaking classes, which isn't too surprising. But even, embroidery, and like some guy wrote me from England who was like a pastor, and he had to write a sermon, and he was blocked, and he discovered my comic book, and it helped him write better sermons, he said. So,
yeah,
doing the Lord's work, what can I say?
There you go. Look at you, changing lives in every way possible. Yeah. Matt, this is absolutely fantastic talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed Ex Libris and Bridge as well. So I'm sure this is going to make for a great collection. Once you get that contract signed, you can get the work put off to the printer.
For sure.
Have a great trip. Safe trip. Enjoy France. Enjoy Spain. Two wonderful places. Love them both.
Yeah, it's gonna be great.
Enjoy your time there. I hope they are beneficial for you and for everybody you come across.
I think it's going to be quite exhausting, but also exhilarating. Kind of lightning round of tours. So
yeah, Matt, thank you for the time, and talk to everyone next week.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.